1978, a low-budget horror film called The Hollow Season premiered at a tiny independent theater in rural Oregon. It was pulled from screens after one night, because the audience fled in terror, convinced what they saw wasn't acted. No one from the production was ever heard from again. For decades it was dismissed as myth, an urban legend whispered among horror fans. But in 2019, a sealed film reel was found in the basement of a demolished farmhouse, containing the original footage. What investigators discovered when they developed it would prove that The Hollow Season was never fiction at all. In the late 1970s, the American horror scene was experiencing a quiet but transformative shift. Independent filmmakers, armed with handheld cameras, borrowed equipment, and unfiltered ambition, were pushing boundaries that mainstream studios wouldn't touch. Somewhere amid this underground wave appeared a film so obscure it almost seemed imaginary: The Hollow Season. No studio claimed it, no critic reviewed it, and no formal record of its release survived beyond a few scattered whispers. Yet for those who claimed to have seen it, the memory was unforgettable, because it didn't feel like fiction. It felt like something captured by accident, like a recording that was never meant to be found. According to the few surviving reports, The Hollow Season premiered for one night only at the Liberty Theater, a small single-screen cinema in Astoria, Oregon. It was late October of 1978, just before Halloween, a night that should have felt festive. But those who attended said the air inside the theater felt strangely heavy, as if everyone sensed something was wrong before the film even began. The posters were hand-painted and crude, showing a wooden barn surrounded by fog. Beneath it, the tagline read, "The harvest never ends." The audience was mostly locals, students, loggers, a few families, curious to see what the mysterious young man who had moved into town earlier that year had created. His name was Elias Harper, a filmmaker who described himself as an anthropological documentarian. He had introduced the film that night in a soft, deliberate tone, claiming it was based on local folklore. But as the projection began, it became apparent that what unspooled on screen didn't resemble a story. It resembled evidence. The film opened with static-laced footage of an isolated farmhouse. The camera wavered between broken windows, half-buried farm tools, and eerie handmade symbols carved into tree bark. There were no opening credits, no soundtrack, only the faint hum of wind. Then a woman's voice began to narrate, but not as a script. She spoke haltingly, describing the harvest that takes what the land gives back. Her tone wasn't theatrical. It was weary, almost afraid. The next 30 minutes followed a group of people, a man, two women, and a teenage boy, as they wandered through the decaying countryside. Their dialogue was strange, unscripted, filled with pauses that felt too long, as if they were waiting for something off camera to happen. Occasionally, one of them would glance directly at the lens, visibly anxious. At one point, a woman whispered, "Can we stop?" before the footage abruptly cut to black. By the midpoint, the film had shifted into chaos. The camera shook violently. The actors screamed. One of them fell to the ground, crawling, while another shouted words that seemed cut off mid-sentence. The audience at the Liberty Theater began murmuring, "Was this real?" The illusion of cinema had vanished completely. One attendee later recalled that when a close-up appeared of what looked like a real human body, burned and bound in straw, someone in the front row vomited. When the lights came up, Harper was gone. The reel was removed, locked away by the theater's manager, and never shown again. Within days, rumors spread that several of the people who had appeared in the film, locals recognized them, had gone missing. The sheriff's office quietly opened an investigation, but no charges were filed. The footage itself disappeared, along with Harper, whose rented cabin was found empty except for stacks of unprocessed film and a single phrase scrawled across the wall in chalk: "The season is complete." No one could prove what The Hollow Season truly was. Some said it was a hoax, others swore it was a confession. But one detail lingered in the minds of those who had seen it: the way the camera seemed too alive, too deliberate, capturing not performance, but something happening in real time. It was as if the film wasn't created to entertain, but to document a ritual no one was meant to witness. The people who appeared in The Hollow Season weren't professional actors, and that was the first thing everyone noticed. They were ordinary townsfolk, people others recognized from daily life. The waitress who served coffee at the diner, the teenager who bagged groceries after school, the logger who repaired fences on weekends. Elias Harper had recruited them quietly, visiting local businesses and asking if anyone wanted to be part of something real. He offered no payment, only the promise of immortality through art. For a small rural town where nothing ever happened, the idea of being in a movie sounded exciting. No one imagined it would be the last thing they'd ever do. Harper arrived in Clatsop County in the spring of 1977. He told people he was escaping the chaos of Los Angeles, where he'd worked briefly on film crews. He rented a small cottage outside town and spent his days wandering through the forests with his Super 8 camera, filming streams, barns, and old churchyards. Locals thought he was odd but harmless. He had a quiet, measured voice and an unsettling way of staring, like he was constantly framing things through an invisible lens. When Harper started his film project, he said it would be a study of isolation and community. He placed a handwritten notice on the bulletin board at the general store. Wanted locals for a documentary-style feature film exploring rural life and folklore. No acting experience required. Within a week, 5 people had signed up. The lead was Margaret Lewis, a waitress in her late 20s who dreamed of leaving Oregon. She told her co-workers that Harper seemed intense but sincere. He had shown her sketches of scenes, fields under fog, figures in robes, candle-lit rituals, and promised it would mean something. Her younger brother Eddie, 17 at the time, joined the project too, along with Tom Grady, a widowed logger known for his quiet nature, and Lydia and Samuel Harper, no relation to Elias, a mother and son who lived on the outskirts of town in a converted barn. Lydia was described as deeply religious, the kind who believed everything was a sign from God. From the start, there was something strange about the way Harper directed them. There was no written script, no clear story. He told them to improvise, to let the truth come through naturally. When they asked what truth he meant, he'd smile and say, "The kind that's older than words." Shooting often took place at night in abandoned places, old barns, empty fields, forgotten graveyards. Harper would position his subjects in precise ways, instructing them not to move, as if he were capturing not actors but relics. Neighbors who happened to pass by remembered hearing chanting, low, rhythmic sounds mixed with the whirring of the camera. Harper carried notebooks filled with symbols that looked like crop markings or runes which he refused to explain. He claimed they represented harvest cycles tied to local legends, but no one in town could recall any folklore like the one he described. Tension grew among the cast. Margaret reportedly confided in a friend that she didn't feel safe. Harper had started referring to her not by name but as the offering. He insisted that each of them play a role as themselves, blurring the line between identity and character. Eddie, her brother, told a classmate that the final scene would involve a real fire, and that Harper had warned them not to break character no matter what happened. Filming wrapped abruptly after a storm in late October. The group was seen together for the last time near an abandoned barn on county land. Witnesses recalled seeing dim lights flickering through the trees that night like torches. The next morning, Harper's truck was parked outside the diner, but no one could find him. The townspeople assumed he'd gone back to California. Only later, when the missing persons reports started piling up, did they realize every one of his actors had vanished too. People still debate why they agreed to work with him, why no one intervened sooner. But perhaps the answer lies in how ordinary the whole thing seemed at first. A film project, a bit of excitement in a quiet town. Harper's genius or madness was in how he made them believe they were creating art, when, in reality, he was staging something far darker. For the cast, there was never a moment they stepped onto a movie set. They had stepped into a trap designed to look like cinema but built for something else entirely. A record of real people fading, frame by frame, into fiction that wasn't fiction at all. Rumors about what happened during the production of the Hollow season began almost immediately after the film's single screening. People whispered that the screams heard in the movie weren't staged, that one of the actors, Margaret Lewis, had truly died on camera. The sheriff's department never confirmed it, but those who had seen the original footage swore that the terror on her face was too raw, too unfiltered to be performance. Something had gone horribly wrong in those woods, and whatever it was, Elias Harper had caught every second of it. The first real clue that something sinister had happened came from the parents of Eddie Lewis. Margaret's younger brother. When he failed to return home after the final days of filming, they drove out to the barn where Harper had been shooting. They found tire tracks in the mud, bits of burned straw and a trail of reddish stains leading toward the tree line. The stains were never tested, at least not officially, but locals said the smell was unmistakable. Harper's equipment was gone, his cabin emptied overnight. The only thing left behind was a length of film strip, water-damaged but still legible. When one of the deputies held it up to the light, he reportedly turned pale. The frames showed Eddie kneeling, blindfolded, surrounded by people in long, tattered robes. As word spread, fear gripped the town. Some believed Harper had fallen in with a cult, outsiders who'd been seen camping near the old sawmill weeks earlier. Others thought he'd lost his mind, sacrificing his caste in pursuit of a masterpiece that blurred the line between truth and horror. Whatever the explanation, no one could ignore that the people who appeared in his movie were missing. Within a month, 5 missing person reports had been filed, all tied to the Hollow season. The sheriff's department tried to downplay it at first. Officially, they said Harper and his crew had moved on, but behind closed doors, investigators were unsettled by what they found in the surrounding woods. Makeshift altars made of stone, dead animals arranged in circles, and fragments of film buried in shallow pits. Each fragment showed something different. A hand reaching out of darkness, a close-up of an eye, a fire burning in a field. When stitched together, the pieces formed no coherent story, only chaos and panic. A former projectionist at the Liberty Theater, who had handled the original reel, later came forward with his own account. He said the film they screened that night didn't have any credits, and the final scene seemed cut off mid-scream. He also claimed that just before the last frame burned out, a faint voice could be heard whispering, "We gave him what he wanted." The projectionist quit his job 2 days later and moved out of state. He never spoke publicly again. As the years passed, the legend grew darker. People began claiming that anyone who watched the recovered fragments experienced hallucinations, flashes of light, phantom voices calling their name. Archivists dismissed it as mass hysteria, but even some of the deputies who handled the evidence refused to speak about it. The few who did said that Harper's camera had been found buried in a shallow grave near the filming site, its film compartment empty but coated in dried blood. The strangest detail emerged years later. In the early 1990s, when a retired detective anonymously mailed a copy of his notes to a Portland journalist. The notes described a set of photographs taken during the original investigation, grainy black and white stills from inside Harper's cabin. In one, a wall was covered with Polaroids of the missing cast, each photo marked with a date and a single word underneath: returned. The meaning of the word remains unclear, but some believe it refers to Harper's obsession with the idea of harvest, the cyclical taking and giving back of life. To him, the film was never about storytelling, it was about transformation, capturing the precise moment when human fear became something eternal, whether the deaths were intentional sacrifices, accidents, or something beyond understanding. One truth became undeniable to those who studied the case. The Hollow season had crossed the line between art and atrocity. It wasn't a film about horror, it was a film made of horror itself. In 2019, more than 40 years after the disappearance of Elias Harper and his cast, the legend of the Hollow season was little more than an internet myth. Film historians dismissed it as a small-town ghost story, a mix of urban folklore and misremembered rumors. But that changed when a demolition crew was clearing the remains of a weather-beaten farmhouse outside Clatsop County. Beneath the warped floorboards, hidden under a layer of dirt and mold, they struck something metallic, a rusted trunk sealed with corroded bolts. Inside, wrapped in decaying cloth and newspaper dated October 1978, was a canister marked in fading ink, "The Hollow Season Final Cut." The discovery made local news for a day or two before being picked up by national outlets. Most assumed it was a hoax, another artifact planted by horror enthusiasts to fuel conspiracy forums. But once the canister reached the archives at Portland State University, everything changed. Archivist Dr. Helen Mathers, who led the film restoration, later said in an interview that from the moment she opened the reel box, she knew it wasn't a fake. The celluloid stock was genuine 1970s Kodachrome, brittle and discolored with age, yet in remarkably good condition. The canister also contained a small envelope of still photographs, grainy images of the cast standing in front of a barn, their faces vacant and unsmiling. The restoration process took months. Each frame had to be cleaned, digitized, and stabilized for viewing. The footage appeared unedited, a single continuous take lasting just under 90 minutes. At first glance, it seemed like any other experimental film of the era. Washed-out countryside scenes, long silences, strange camera angles. But as the technicians watched, their unease grew. The people on screen weren't acting. They moved with a stiff mechanical fear, glancing repeatedly toward the camera operator as though following silent commands. Their clothes were dirty and torn, their eyes hollow. Halfway through the film, the tone shifted abruptly. The camera tilted, panning toward what looked like an altar made of wood and stone. Symbols, similar to agricultural markings, were etched across the surface. A figure stepped into frame, face obscured by a sack, and raised what appeared to be a blade. The screams that followed were muffled but unmistakably real. Dr. Mathers, visibly shaken in later interviews, refused to describe what came next in detail, saying only that it didn't look staged and it didn't look like performance. The university immediately halted the restoration and contacted law enforcement. A forensic team analyzed the physical film and made several disturbing discoveries. Microscopic residue on the celluloid tested positive for type O negative blood, human. Further examination revealed faint fingerprints belonging to at least 3 individuals, none of whom were ever identified. Even more chilling was what appeared in the margins of certain frames. Small evidence tags, marked with police serial numbers from 1977, suggesting that some of the footage might have been shot at an actual crime scene. When word of the discovery leaked, online forums exploded. Some users claimed to have seen fragments of the restored footage uploaded briefly before being taken down. Others insisted the reel was cursed, recounting that people who worked on the restoration suffered insomnia, paranoia, or sudden illness. Though most of these stories were easily debunked, one account stood out, from a graduate student who had handled the negatives for cataloging. She claimed that in one frame she saw her own reflection in a window. Only the reflection was smiling. Though she hadn't been, authorities eventually sealed the reel as evidence, and the university was ordered not to release any portion of it publicly. Still, a few frames leaked to private collectors and underground film communities. The images were haunting, figures kneeling in a field, a barn door half open, and Elias Harper himself, barely visible in the shadows, holding the camera like a weapon. For many, the rediscovery of the Hollow season confirmed what locals had always suspected, that the film wasn't an act of creation but documentation. It captured something that had truly happened in 1977, something far darker than any horror fiction could conjure. What the lens preserved wasn't a story, it was evidence. When forensic investigators examined the recovered reel of the Hollow season, they expected to find tricks, clever editing, stage makeup, or red paint meant to mimic gore. What they found instead was evidence that shattered any illusion of artifice. The analysis began at the Oregon State Forensic Laboratory, where technicians subjected the film to chemical and microscopic testing. It didn't take long for anomalies to appear. The discolorations on certain frames weren't pigment or photographic error. They were traces of real blood, dried and fused into the celluloid. The molecular composition matched human type O negative, one of the rarest blood types, and the same type listed in several missing persons reports from 1977. The discovery sparked a renewed investigation, reopening what had long been considered an urban legend. A forensic pathologist named Dr. Raymond Keller led the examination, and his notes later leaked to the press. Keller wrote that the blood was distributed in patterns inconsistent with staged violence, suggesting the camera had been operating during an actual event rather than a reenactment. He noted, too, that the lighting flickers in certain moments corresponded to real flame bursts, not artificial set effects. The film, he concluded, was not edited to simulate chaos, it was chaos documented. Even more disturbing were the forensic findings hidden in the background of the footage. Analysts noticed numbered tags on several objects scattered near the altar shown in the film's second half. When enhanced digitally, the numbers matched police evidence tags from Clatsop County dating to 1977. The implication was chilling. Part of the footage might have been shot at the site of an active or recently investigated crime scene. In other words, Harper could have obtained or recreated real evidence of murder for his film. Within weeks, forensic teams conducted a cross-analysis with archived police records. They discovered that the evidence tag numbers corresponded to a series of unsolved disappearances from late 1977, specifically the missing persons connected to Harper's film crew. The original case files mentioned the discovery of organic material found near an abandoned barn, which had since been lost in a fire. Now it seemed fragments of that material had somehow ended up inside the movie itself. The reel also contained a disturbing auditory layer. Forensic audio engineers isolated low-frequency sounds beneath the main dialogue, tones almost imperceptible to the human ear. When amplified, they revealed faint background noises, footsteps, sobbing, and something resembling whispered chanting. One phrase repeated in an archaic dialect, loosely translated as, "The offering endures." Linguists later traced the phrase's structure to fragments of Old Norse harvest rituals. Though no one could explain how Harper might have known them, a small piece of the canister's interior lining was sent for additional testing, revealing another grim clue: residue consistent with formaldehyde and calcium phosphate, compounds often associated with preserved organic tissue. Someone, it appeared, had handled human remains before sealing the film away. The deeper the analysis went, the less the evidence behaved like cinema. There were no production markers, no clapperboards, no camera notes, no continuity slates. Even the reel itself was hand-cut with uneven splices, suggesting that Harper developed it manually, perhaps in the same darkroom where he filmed. In several frames, faint silhouettes appeared in the background, figures that moved inconsistently with the rest of the scene, as if they were standing behind the camera. Watching, Keller and his team eventually stopped their work without completing it. According to internal memos, some members refused to continue after a section of the film showed what they described as a human body partially consumed by fire, filmed without interruption. The expression on the person's face, Keller noted, was one of awareness. News of the findings spread quietly through forensic circles but never reached mainstream outlets. The few journalists who tried to report on it were met with sudden stonewalling, as if someone higher up wanted the story buried. But the official lab summary, heavily redacted, still survives. It states that the film medium itself contains biological evidence consistent with homicide investigation parameters, effectively classifying the Hollow Season not as a work of art, but as physical proof of a violent crime. That conclusion transformed the legend into something much darker. The Hollow Season was no longer a lost horror film. It was a murder scene, one captured, preserved, and hidden for over 40 years inside a reel that pretended to be fiction. As the forensic evidence from the Hollow Season came to light, investigators began tracing its geographical and historical context. What they found was a chilling overlap between the film's locations and a string of unsolved disappearances that had haunted the region for decades. Between 1976 and 1978, at least 7 individuals vanished within a 30-mile radius of the small Oregon towns of Astoria, Canapa, and Svensson. Most were last seen traveling along logging roads or near abandoned farmland, the same rural spaces that appeared prominently in Harper's film. For years, police had treated the cases as isolated incidents, assuming the victims had run away, drowned, or fallen victim to wildlife. But the rediscovered reel suggested a far more coordinated pattern. The first disappearance linked to the case was that of Marjorie Klein, a 32-year-old teacher who vanished after attending a church picnic in the summer of 1976. Her car was found parked on a dirt road, keys still in the ignition, with a note on the dashboard that read, "He said he could show me something beautiful." The handwriting was hers. In the newly restored film, one of the first scenes shows a woman resembling Marjorie walking through a field, barefoot and disoriented, with a small cross hanging around her neck. Another missing person, Henry Dray, a retired logger, had disappeared in September 1977 after telling a friend he was hired as a consultant for a movie project that was about the old rituals. Dray's distinctive plaid jacket was visible in the background of one sequence in the film, folded neatly beside a pile of firewood. Investigators later confirmed that the pattern matched one described in Dray's police file. More connections followed. In one shot, the camera lingered on a child's toy, an old wooden horse half buried in the dirt near the barn. When compared with evidence photos from a 1977 missing child case, the toy was identical to one owned by 6-year-old Samuel Harper, who had disappeared alongside his mother, Lydia. Their inclusion in the film blurred any remaining line between fiction and documentation. Harper hadn't simply used locals as actors. He had recorded their final moments. The barn itself, a recurring backdrop throughout the Hollow season, became the focal point of the investigation. Historical maps identified it as belonging to a farm that had burned down in 1969. Curiously, police reports from that same property referenced an unregistered church group that met there in the 1950s, rumored to practice agrarian spiritualism, a mix of pagan harvest rites and evangelical fervor. Their teachings emphasized the cyclical debt between humans and the land, the idea that what is taken must someday be returned. The same phrase appeared scratched into the barn's doorway in the film, visible for a single frame before the image cut to black. Researchers began to suspect that Elias Harper had discovered remnants of that cult, or revived it. His personal notebooks, recovered from his abandoned cabin, contained rough sketches of symbols found both in the film and in police photographs of the area: concentric circles, crossed sickles, and a stylized sun with bleeding rays. The margins were filled with phrases like "film is confession" and "the ritual must be seen." To Harper, the camera wasn't just a tool. It was a vessel of transformation, a means of offering truth to whatever force he believed demanded it. One investigator described how eerily the geography of the disappearances matched the camera's path through the film. The order of scenes seemed to mirror the real-world sequence in which people had gone missing. It was as if Harper was mapping his crimes, or the cult's actions, through the language of cinema, turning each abduction into a frame of a larger ritual. The final connection came when digital analysts compared the timestamps embedded in the reel's emulsion with the dates of missing persons reports. The match was precise down to the day. The footage wasn't only real, it was chronological. The Hollow season had recorded the disappearances in real time, transforming a local legend into a visual ledger of death. Every cut, every shift in perspective corresponded to someone vanishing forever from the town's quiet outskirts, swallowed by the fog and by the lens of a man who believed he was capturing eternity through horror. By the time researchers pieced together the evidence, one final and dreadful theory began to take shape. The Hollow season was not a movie about a ritual. It was the ritual itself. Every element of the film, from the staging to the camera movement, appeared to serve a ceremonial purpose. Forensic anthropologists and occult historians who studied the reel independently reached similar conclusions. The film's imagery aligned disturbingly well with rural pagan rites tied to fertility, sacrifice, and the cyclical return of life to the soil. What made it more terrifying was that Harper had turned those rituals into cinema, using the act of filming as a substitute for worship. The camera in his hands was both an instrument of art and a weapon of devotion. When investigators slowed down certain sections of the footage, they noticed a recurring pattern: flickering frames that appeared to form symbols when frozen. The sequence of markings corresponded to ancient harvest runes used in Northern Europe to signify the offering of life for yield. Harper had been obsessed with these ideas. His journals, recovered from the ruins of his cabin, described a belief that film could trap the essence of the living and preserve it in light. He wrote that when one commits a true act of creation, the soul becomes engraved upon the emulsion. It wasn't metaphor. He seemed to believe that recording death transformed it into eternal harvest, turning mortality into permanence. Several experts noticed that Harper's framing choices had a ritualistic consistency. The victims, or actors, were often centered within circular arrangements of natural objects, stones, branches, or straw. In one particularly haunting shot, the barn's floor was covered in a spiral of ash with Harper's camera positioned precisely at its center, turning slowly as if marking time. When investigators measured the rotation speed, they found it matched the rhythm of an old Norse chant recorded faintly on the film's audio track. It was as though every technical decision, the focus pulls, the timing of light, the transitions, was dictated by ceremonial precision. A former student of Harper's from his short-lived days at UCLA's film department came forward years later, claiming Harper once delivered a lecture on cinematic resurrection. He had told the class that a camera doesn't record, it consumes. He spoke of an experiment in authenticity, where the truth could only be revealed through genuine suffering. At the time, his peers thought he was being provocative. In hindsight, it sounded like a confession. The rediscovered footage ended with a scene that experts still can't fully explain. After an extended sequence of chaotic movement and screams, the camera abruptly steadies. The frame focuses on an open field at dawn, the barn smoldering behind it. A figure, presumed to be Harper, steps into view. He lowers the camera to the ground, and for several seconds the image tilts upward toward the sky. The sound of wind grows louder, joined by faint whispers. Then, one by one, blurred shapes begin to appear in the distance, people standing still, facing the camera. Their bodies don't move, but the shadows cast by them do, as though the light itself were alive. In the film's final moments, Harper's reflection becomes visible in the lens. His expression is serene, almost reverent, as he mouths words too faint to decipher. Lip readers who analyzed the footage believed he said, "It's complete." Then the reel cuts to black, followed by a single frame of text scratched directly into the film stock. What we record remains. The few who have seen the complete reel in person describe an inexplicable sensation, an almost physical heaviness, as though the film emits more than images. Some claim the air in the viewing room grew colder as the final frame appeared. Others said the sound of wind continued even after the projector stopped. Whether these accounts are psychological reactions or something more cannot be proven, but the result is the same: the sense that Harper succeeded in his goal. Modern scholars now debate whether the Hollow season captured a murder, a ritual, or a metaphysical experiment. Perhaps it was all three. To Harper, there was never a boundary between creation and destruction. He believed the act of filming was the offering itself, the sacrifice of light, time, and human life to a lens that would never stop seeing. And though the reel now sits locked in evidence storage, sealed behind temperature-controlled walls, those who've worked near it say they sometimes hear faint scratching from inside the case, as if the film were still running, still recording, still alive. If the story of the Hollow season unsettled you, it should. Somewhere out there, a man once believed he could trap souls inside a camera lens, and maybe in some way he did. We may never know what truly happened on that abandoned farm, or why those who watched the reel claimed it still breathed. But what if Harper wasn't the only one? How many other films, forgotten and unfinished, hide their own ghosts in celluloid? If you felt that chill, if you want to keep uncovering the buried truths that history tried to erase, subscribe and stay with us. We're only just beginning to explore the darkness that lingers between fact and legend. Tell us in the comments, do you believe the Hollow season was simply madness? Or something far older and far darker, using film as its vessel? Every week we bring another forgotten mystery back into the light, stories that were never meant to be found. Join us, and together we'll keep looking into the places where history blurs and the truth refuses to stay buried.